Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland. I'm continuing my series for GCSE history about international relations between the wars. So this video is about the League of Nations. It was an international organization that aimed to solve disputes through negotiation. And the idea was that war could be avoided through something called collective security. If one country attacked another, then all the member states of the League of Nations would go to war against that aggressor. That was the idea: support victims, and countries would refrain from aggression because they knew that the whole world would go against them. In the 1930s, school books were printed assuring school children that there could never be another war because now there is collective security. The trouble with collective security is it requires countries to fight when it's not in their national interest to do so. Supposing country A attacks country B, country C could remain neutral, or country C could go to war against country A. Well, country C might be minded to just stay out of this one. There's very rarely a dispute in which 100% of the justice is on one side and 100% of the injustice is on the other side. Human affairs are like that, not like that. Usually more of a mixed picture. That one side might be mainly righteous and the other side is mainly fighting for turpitude, but it's not total. And it's difficult not to know what to believe when there's claim and counterclaim. It might be in one's national interest to even assist the aggressor. So country C would probably prefer to avoid bloodshed if it is avoidable. And you're not certain you're going to win. And will country D join you as well? They might remain neutral. Anyway, but country C might think, well, if we help country A, not necessarily fighting, but selling them arms, they might help us in our dispute with country D, something like that. It's all too easy to be preoccupied with short-term advantage. Fighting for peace seems to be a contradiction in terms. So countries had been manufacturing weapons like bilio from 1914 to 1918. The 1920s, there was severe hardship and shortage of almost everything except weapons. Europe was awash in guns, and countries downsized their militaries radically. So weapons were being sold for bargain basement prices. You can imagine what that did to international instability. So armed forces have been trimmed to the bone, but you could get guns very cheaply. Often they're sold in other places, in Latin America, for example. So collective security was going to be tricky to get to work. The League of Nations did not have its own army, navy, or air force. People did discuss setting up a League of Nations military. So the League of Nations have its own army and navy and air force, can use those for League of Nations missions. But that did not come to fruition. The League of Nations would therefore have to rely upon its member states using their armed forces for League of Nations missions. Same deal with the UN these days. The UN does have them under UN command, wearing blue helmets for the UN sometimes. So member states of the League of Nations were unwilling to fight former allies so soon after the First World War. They looked out for self-interest. They felt a debt of honour to their erstwhile allies. A war, even a just war, can be unpopular. People saying, is it absolutely necessary? Couldn't we give diplomacy a bit more time? How about sanctions? Things like that. In many countries, League of Nations unions were formed. This is an organization that anybody could join who wanted to promote the work of the League of Nations and felt that through the League of Nations, bloodshed could always be averted. In the United Kingdom, in the 1930s, the League of Nations Union held a referendum, sending out ballot papers to every adult in the country, asking them to vote, do you reject the United Kingdom ever going to war again? And a lot of people didn't bother to reply, but of those who wrote back, a high majority said, yes, I'm against fighting under any circumstances whatsoever. So millions of people were voting for peace. It seemed to be very optimistic. It was an unofficial referendum. The government said it had nothing to do with it. But one cannot dispute the authenticity. There's no doubt the majority of people did want to avoid war, which is a healthy thing and is not surprising so soon after such a horrific conflict. Politicians were obliged to take note. There was no appetite for war. In fact, there was an overwhelming desire for peace at almost any price. Aggressive governments by the 1930s perceived the League of Nations was a paper tiger. It would not take any serious action to push back aggression, and therefore aggressors grew ever more audacious. These aggressive governments included the Nazi government in Germany and the governments of Japan and Italy. So what can we conclude? The treaties of Paris were fairly harsh, despite the Big Four wanting long-term peace. Big Four, of course, disagreed about the best way to achieve long-term peace. Was it to permanently disable Germany, or was it to treat Germany with kid gloves? Clemenceau wanted to make peace by so weakening Germany that she could never pose any threat in future. France had a great deal of clout because, of course, the war had mostly been won with French blood on the Western Front. France had suffered much more heavily than the other Big Four, so therefore had moral authority on this one. And France was going to bear the brunt of a future war because she was adjacent to Germany. Wilson got only a few of his 14 points in the treaty. Given the context, it's not surprising the treaties turned out the way that they did. People were boiling. Their blood was boiling with indignation after millions upon millions of bereavements. These are mostly young men who are being killed. If a geriatric relative of yours is called to his or her reward through natural causes, then the grief is something we can cope with without that much difficulty. But if it's your teenage brother or son, then it's going to hit you as a much heavier blow. So it was extremely difficult to be objective, to achieve detachment from such a highly emotive topic. Therefore, in the 1930s, it's clear to see that one of the negative spin-offs of the Paris peace treaties was that Allied countries felt perhaps too guilty about these peace treaties and therefore were unwilling to uphold them. They began to think that these treaties had been conceived in a mood of ire, were unreasonable, and just unworkable. Therefore, the way to justice and the means of assuring permanent peace was to allow the treaties to be jettisoned. Hitler and Mussolini were in office by then, Eastern Europe was being destabilized, and the League of Nations proved to be feeble at exactly the wrong moment. So the Big Four had different attitudes towards Germany. By the Big Four, I mean Wilson, Orlando, Lloyd George, and Clemenceau, and indeed their respective governments after these leaders had gone. The treaties were flawed, and they were challenged quite soon after they were signed. The international situation calmed down in the 1920s, but in the 1930s, placidity gave way to rising tension and bellicosity. Let's look now at Poland and Russia in the early 1920s.